The proposition. Edward Sterling sat in his sleek, high-rise office, the walls adorned with awards and framed magazine covers that declared him a self-made billionaire, a ruthless dealmaker, and a financial titan. The city skyline stretched endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, a shimmering testament to his success. Yet, for the first time in his life, it all felt hollow. Edward exhaled, pinching the bridge of his nose as his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Sir, your 2 p.m. is here. Send them in." The glass doors swung open, and 2 men in pressed suits stepped inside. Edward recognized them instantly. Representatives from the Lockhart government contract, the most lucrative deal his company had ever pursued. Billions were at stake. This was the contract that would cement Sterling Enterprises as an untouchable force in the corporate world. Edward stood, extending a firm handshake. "Gentlemen, welcome." The older man, Mr. Caldwell, smiled, but there was a hesitancy in his expression. "Edward, let's get straight to the point. We've reviewed your proposal, and we're impressed." A flicker of satisfaction crossed Edward's face. Of course they were. However, the younger representative added, shifting in his seat, "We have concerns." Edward's expression didn't change, but his grip on the chair tightened. "Concerns?" Caldwell nodded. "It's your public image, Edward. Lockhart is looking for partners who are not only financially stable, but also family-oriented, grounded, someone the public can trust." Edward felt the first prick of irritation. "Trust. My company has built entire industries, created thousands of jobs. That's real impact, not some PR illusion." The younger man shrugged. "That may be true, but perception matters. Right now, the media paints you as, well, let's just say not the most relatable businessman. Investors respect you, but the public, they see you as a cold, untouchable CEO. A change in perception could be the key to securing this deal." Edward leaned back in his chair, contemplating. Relatable. He had never cared for such nonsense. His personal life was his own. His work spoke for itself. But now, his lack of a warm public persona was suddenly a liability. "And how exactly do you suggest I become relatable overnight?" Edward asked, his voice sharp. Caldwell smiled knowingly. "A fiancée would be a good start." Silence. Edward blinked, certain he had misheard. "A fiancée. Think about it." The younger man continued. "The media loves a love story. A steady, serious relationship will make you look more human, more grounded. It will also show Lockhart that you're capable of commitment, not just in business, but in life." Edward scoffed. "You can't be serious." "We are," Caldwell said simply. "Of course, it's just a suggestion, but it's something to think about." As the men left, Edward sat in silence, his mind a whirlwind of calculations. He had spent years building his empire, making strategic moves, outmaneuvering competitors. But now he was being told that the difference between sealing this multi-billion-dollar deal and losing it came down to a fake love story, a calculated decision. By the time Edward called his team for an emergency meeting, the idea had settled in his mind. "I need a fiancée," he announced to his PR and legal team. His PR manager, Sarah, nearly choked on her coffee. "Excuse me." Edward folded his hands on the desk. "A public, serious engagement will solve my image problem. So we find someone." His CFO, Tom, frowned. "You can't just buy a relationship, Edward." Edward smirked. "Watch me." Sarah hesitated. "If we do this, it has to look real. We'll need someone convincing." Edward's mind raced. He needed someone smart, adaptable, with no personal connections that could complicate things. An actress, a model, a socialite. No, too risky. He needed someone outside his world. That's when he saw her. The woman in the shadow of his empire. Edward's office overlooked a small street vendor setup just outside his building. He had noticed the stall a handful of times, never enough to care. But now his sharp eyes honed in on the woman behind the table. She was young, poised but not polished, and dark-skinned with deep brown eyes that held quiet determination. She was arranging small handcrafted pieces, jewelry, miniature paintings, intricate paper quillings. Her hands worked with a precision that rivaled his own in business. Edward tapped his assistant's shoulder. "Who is she?" His assistant blinked. "Sir." Edward gestured. "The woman. The vendor outside." A quick check on his tablet. "Her name is Maya Brooks. She sells handmade crafts here daily. Lives in a low-income area on the south side. Runs a small art program for kids, struggling financially." Edward's mind snapped to a decision. Perfect. He didn't need someone from his world. He needed someone who wouldn't expect love. Someone who needed his money. A business arrangement. A contract. No emotions, no strings attached. The offer that changed everything. That evening, Maya was packing up her remaining crafts, rubbing her sore fingers. It had been a slow day, and she was worried about rent. "Miss Brooks." She turned, startled to see Edward Sterling himself. He was a man out of place in her world. Tall, immaculately dressed, and exuding effortless power. Maya hesitated. "Mr. Sterling." Edward offered a business card. "I have a proposition for you." She narrowed her eyes, suspicious. "A proposition?" Edward's expression didn't change. "I need a fiancée." Maya's mouth fell open. "What?" Edward continued, his tone pure business. "You pretend to be engaged to me for the next 10 months. In return, I'll pay you handsomely. You'll have financial stability, full sponsorship for your art center, and every resource you need." Maya's heart pounded. This couldn't be real. "And what do you get?" she asked, voice low. Edward's lips curled slightly. "The public sees a softer, family-oriented version of me. I secure my contract. And then, when it's over..." He paused, meeting her eyes. "We walk away. No strings attached." Maya clenched the card in her hands. This money could change her life. But was it worth the cost? As Edward waited for her answer, Maya felt herself standing at a crossroads she never expected. And whatever choice she made next would change everything. A deal with the devil. Maya Brooks sat on the edge of her worn-out couch, staring at the business card in her trembling hands. Edward Sterling, CEO of Sterling Enterprises, a billionaire, a man whose world was so far removed from hers that it felt almost laughable. And yet, he had just offered her a deal that could change everything. Her tiny apartment was barely holding together. The leaky faucet, the cracked walls, the piles of past-due bills. And then there was the art center, the one place in the community that gave kids hope, that kept them off the streets, that kept their dreams alive. It was barely surviving, just like she was. Maya exhaled slowly. Was she really considering this? Her pride screamed at her, "You are not for sale." But reality whispered back, "You can save the art center. You can change your life." Her phone felt heavy in her hands. She could say no, walk away, and struggle like she always had. Or she could call him back. Her fingers hovered over the number. And then, before she could talk herself out of it, she dialed. 1 ring. 2. 3. Then, his deep, controlled voice. "Edward Sterling." Maya took a breath. "I'll do it." Silence. And then, a satisfied chuckle. "Good. You won't regret this, Miss Brooks." The contract that came with chains. 2 days later, Maya stood in Edward's pristine office, feeling entirely out of place. Everything was sleek, modern, and utterly devoid of warmth, much like the man himself. Edward sat behind his massive desk, flipping through the contract in front of him. "Let's go over the terms." Maya nodded, her fingers clenched together in her lap. "You will pose as my fiancé for 10 months, he stated coolly, flipping a page. "You'll attend social events, charity galas, and business functions. You will be seen in public with me, hold my hand when necessary, and behave as a loving partner. Maya swallowed hard. And in return, Edward's gaze flicked up, piercing. You'll receive a monthly stipend, enough to cover your personal expenses, plus a lump sum at the end of our agreement. Additionally, I will fund your art center and ensure it stays open. Maya's breath caught. The art center saved. The kids would have a future. Edward continued, his tone sharp. This arrangement is strictly business. No real relationship. No feelings. No complications. Maya scoffed. Trust me, falling for you is not on my list of priorities. Edward smirked. Let's keep it that way. She should have walked away right then, but she didn't. Instead, she picked up the pen, hands shaking, and signed the contract. And just like that, Maya Brooks became the fake fiancée of Edward Sterling, thrown into the fire. The first test came almost immediately. That evening, Edward whisked Maya to an exclusive gala. Maya had been inside fancy hotels before, but this was another world. Chandeliers sparkled overhead, champagne flowed like water, and every woman in sight dripped in designer labels. And then there was Edward, dressed in a tailored black suit, exuding raw power. Maya felt suffocated. She didn't belong here. She tugged at the tight, unfamiliar dress Edward's stylist had forced her into. Are you sure about this? She whispered as they entered. Edward didn't even look at her. Smile. Then, without warning, his hand slid around her waist, pulling her close. Maya stiffened. What are you doing? Edward leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper, making it look real. And just like that, they were the center of attention. Whispers spread like wildfire. Who's the new woman on Edward Sterling's arm? Where did she come from? Maya forced herself to smile, but every instinct screamed at her to run. This was a mistake. A woman in a shimmering silver dress sauntered up to them. Edward, she purred, her eyes flickering to Maya like she was some kind of insect. I didn't realize you had a fiancée. Maya recognized her instantly. Claire Lockhart, heiress to the very company Edward was trying to land a deal with. Edward's grip on Maya's waist tightened. Claire. Always a pleasure. Claire's lips curled. And you are? She asked Maya, voice dripping with condescension. Maya smiled sweetly, channeling every ounce of fake charm she could muster. Maya Brooks, Edward's fiancée. Claire's eyes narrowed. She didn't believe it. And then she did something unexpected. She laughed. Oh, Edward, a fiancé. Claire took a slow sip of champagne, gaze burning into him. How fascinating. Maya clenched her fists. She might be an outsider in this world, but she wasn't going to let some rich woman dismiss her. Edward, however, remained perfectly composed, unbothered, unshaken. This was all a game to him. And Maya, she was just a pawn. The ice begins to crack. The event dragged on, and Maya found herself standing alone near a massive balcony, staring at the city lights. Then, Edward appeared beside her. You handled yourself well, he admitted. Maya scoffed. Oh, I thought Claire was going to throw her drink on me. Edward smirked. She still might. Maya sighed. Why do you even want this contract so badly? For the first time, Edward hesitated. Because winning is all I know. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. Because winning is all I know. Maya turned to face him. That's it. Just winning. Edward exhaled, looking out over the city. When you grow up watching people fail, watching them lose everything, because they weren't ruthless enough, you learn that power is the only real security. Maya frowned. For a moment, just a moment, she saw something in him that wasn't ice. Something human. But before she could say anything, Edward turned away. We should go. And just like that, the walls were back up. A dangerous game begins. Over the next few weeks, Maya and Edward played their roles. Public dates, photo shoots, fake laughter. Every day, Maya felt herself getting pulled further into Edward's world of power plays and deception. But something else was happening too. Maya saw cracks in Edward's armor, little moments where he wasn't just the ruthless billionaire. Like when he silently watched the kids at the art center, as if trying to understand why they were so happy with so little. Like when he didn't just write a check for the center, but actually showed up to help paint the walls. Like when, late at night, when they were alone, he let his guard down, just a little. And Maya, she was in trouble. Because no matter how much she told herself this was fake, no matter how much she reminded herself he was cold and calculating, her heart was starting to forget. And she had a terrible, sinking feeling. Edward Sterling wasn't the only one playing a dangerous game. She was too. And she might be the one who lost. A fine line between pretend and real. The illusion begins to blur. Maya Brooks had never been one to deceive herself, but something was happening that she couldn't ignore. It had been a month since she signed the contract. 1 month of luxury, of designer gowns and exclusive events, of carefully choreographed kisses on the cheek, and staged photos of laughter that wasn't always fake. And most dangerous of all, 1 month of Edward Sterling. She had thought she understood the rules of this arrangement. It was pretend. It was a business transaction. But somewhere along the way, between the cold CEO and the guarded man she had glimpsed in rare, unguarded moments, the line had started to blur. It was the little things, like the way Edward's hand lingered a second too long when he guided her through a crowd, the way his gaze softened when he watched her help children at the art center, the way he stood a little too close, his presence almost protective, and the way her own heartbeat betrayed her. Maya hated it, hated that she even noticed, because this wasn't real. And yet, there were moments, dangerous, fleeting moments, when she forgot. An unlikely visitor. One evening, after a particularly exhausting charity event, Maya kicked off her high heels the moment they stepped into Edward's penthouse. "That's it," she groaned. "I refuse to wear heels for the rest of my life. My feet are staging a rebellion." Edward smirked, loosening his tie. "You do realize you'll have to wear them again tomorrow, right?" Maya glared. "Way to crush my dreams, Sterling." He chuckled, a low, rich sound that sent an annoying warmth through her chest. Before she could gather herself, the intercom buzzed. Edward pressed a button. "Yes. Mr. Sterling, you have a visitor." Edward frowned. "I'm not expecting anyone." "It's Claire Lockhart, sir. She insists it's urgent." Maya stiffened. Claire. The woman who had all but called Maya an amusing distraction. The woman whose family was holding Edward's biggest contract in their hands. Edward's face remained unreadable. "Send her up." Maya folded her arms. "Why is she here?" "We're about to find out." The elevator doors slid open a few minutes later, and Claire stepped in like she owned the place. She was effortlessly beautiful, sleek blonde waves, a fitted emerald dress that screamed money, and a confidence that said she was untouchable. Her sharp gaze flicked to Maya. "Still playing house, I see." Maya clenched her fists, but Edward spoke first. "Why are you here, Claire?" Claire smiled, slow and knowing. Straight to the point. "Very well. I came to warn you." Edward's eyes darkened. "Warn me." Claire sauntered past him, settling into one of the penthouse's lavish armchairs. She crossed her legs, her red lips curving in amusement. "Let's stop pretending, Edward. We both know this little engagement of yours is nothing more than a publicity stunt." Maya's stomach twisted, but she kept her face blank. Edward's jaw tightened. "And?" Claire studied her manicured nails. "And my father doesn't take kindly to deception." Edward's expression didn't change, but Maya could feel the shift in the air. "If he finds out you've been lying," Claire continued, "he'll pull the contract." Instantly, silence stretched between them. Then Edward spoke, his voice dangerously calm. "Why are you telling me this?" Claire's lips curved. "Because, dear Edward, I'm giving you an opportunity." She stood and stepped closer, too close, her eyes gleaming like a cat playing with its prey. "I can make this problem disappear. If you walk away from this ridiculous charade and show my father that you are serious about this deal, the contract will be yours." She tilted her head. "And perhaps you and I could finally finish what we started." Maya's breath caught. So that was it. Claire didn't just want Edward to secure the contract. She wanted Edward. Edward Sterling. Her Edward. No, not hers. He wasn't hers. This was fake. So why did it feel like she'd just been punched in the stomach? Edward's face was unreadable as he spoke. "That's not going to happen, Claire." Claire blinked, genuine surprise flickering across her face. "Excuse me." Edward took a step closer, his voice firm. "You're wasting your time. I'm engaged to Maya, and that's not going to change." The words sent a strange warmth through Maya's chest. Claire narrowed her eyes. "You really expect me to believe that?" Edward didn't flinch. "I don't care what you believe." For the first time, Claire's confidence wavered. She turned to Maya, eyes gleaming with a mix of curiosity and challenge. "Tell me, darling," Claire purred, "how long do you think this little act will last?" Maya's heartbeat thundered in her ears. She could feel Edward's gaze on her, waiting. And suddenly, she knew what she had to do. She stepped closer to Edward, resting a hand on his chest. "Forever." Edward stiffened for half a second. Then, to Maya's complete shock, his arms slid around her waist, and before she could even process what was happening, his lips brushed against hers. It was soft at first, just a whisper of contact, a performance. But then, something shifted. The heat between them ignited, and suddenly, it wasn't just for show. Edward's hand tangled in her hair, pulling her closer. The world disappeared. It wasn't fake anymore. Maya barely registered the sound of Claire scoffing. "Enjoy your little fantasy while it lasts," Claire muttered before storming out. The elevator doors shut behind her, and yet neither Maya nor Edward moved. Their foreheads rested together, their breaths mingling, their bodies still entangled. Edward's voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. "That wasn't part of the plan." Maya swallowed, her heart slamming against her ribs. "I know." They slowly pulled apart, and for the first time since their agreement began, Maya felt completely lost. Because that kiss, it hadn't been pretend. It had been real. And that terrified her more than anything. When lies begin to feel like truth, a kiss that changed everything. Maya sat in silence, staring at the city lights outside Edward's penthouse window. Her heart still thundered in her chest, her lips tingling from a kiss that was never supposed to happen. Edward stood across the room, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. He hadn't spoken since Claire left, since he kissed her. Because that's what happened. He kissed her, not for the contract, not for show, but because, in that moment, something had shifted between them. Maya's fingers traced her lips absent-mindedly. "This is dangerous." They were supposed to keep things clear, business only, no emotions, no real connection. And yet that kiss had felt more real than anything in her life. Edward suddenly exhaled sharply, breaking the silence. "We should talk." Maya tore her gaze away from the window, forcing herself to meet his eyes. Those stormy gray eyes that had always seemed so unreadable. But now, for the first time, they were anything but. "About what?" she asked, her voice steadier than she expected. Edward's jaw tightened. "About that." Maya forced a smirk. "Oh, you mean the part where you kissed me like your life depended on it." Edward's eyes darkened. "Maya." She stood, crossing her arms. "What do you want me to say, Edward? That it meant nothing? That I'll just forget about it?" Edward hesitated. Maya scoffed. "You can't even lie to yourself, can you?" Silence stretched between them. And that's when Maya realized something. Edward Sterling, the man who could manipulate billion-dollar deals, who controlled every aspect of his life with meticulous precision, was terrified. Not of losing a contract, Not of the media finding out their engagement was fake, but of this, of them, of what was happening between them that neither of them could stop. Maya's chest tightened. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had promised herself she wouldn't fall. But it was too late. She was already slipping. And she wasn't sure if Edward would catch her or let her crash. A war of distance and proximity. For the next week, Maya and Edward barely spoke. They still went to events together, still played the role of the perfect, loving couple in front of cameras. But when they were alone, it was tense. Edward avoided her, throwing himself into work, staying late at the office, leaving early in the morning. Maya tried to tell herself she was fine with it, that it was better this way. But every time she caught him stealing glances at her when he thought she wasn't looking. Every time his fingers brushed against hers and he pulled away too quickly. Every time she found herself alone in the penthouse, staring at his empty side of the couch. She knew she was lying to herself. She wanted him to stop running. And deep down, she knew he wanted to stop too. But neither of them knew how. An unexpected date. One evening, after yet another event where they pretended like nothing had changed, Edward's driver pulled up in front of the penthouse. Maya reached for the door handle, but Edward suddenly grabbed her wrist. Her breath caught. She looked up at him, and for the first time in days, his walls were down. "Come with me," he said. Maya frowned. "Where?" Edward hesitated, then exhaled. "Somewhere that isn't a business function. Somewhere I can just..." He trailed off. Maya's heart pounded. "Be yourself." Edward's grip on her wrist tightened just slightly before he nodded. Maya searched his face, looking for hesitation, but all she found was something raw. And that terrified her, because she wanted this so badly. "Okay," she whispered. Edward didn't take her to a 5-star restaurant. He didn't take her to a gala or a high-profile social event. He took her to a quiet, hole-in-the-wall jazz bar tucked away in the city, the kind of place where nobody knew his name, where he wasn't Edward Sterling, billionaire businessman, where he was just Edward. They sat in a dimly lit booth, and for the first time, there were no photographers, no expectations, no pretending. Just them, and the silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was comfortable. Edward watched her as she swirled her drink absent-mindedly. "I didn't always want this life, you know." Maya looked up, surprised. Edward never talked about his past. He barely talked about anything that wasn't business. "What did you want?" she asked softly. Edward let out a humorless chuckle. "To disappear." Maya's heart clenched. Edward sighed, staring into his whiskey glass. "My father was a failure. He was reckless with money, with people. I watched him ruin everything. Our home, our family, our future." He shook his head. "I swore I'd never be like him. So I built something. Something unbreakable." Maya swallowed. "And you became the cold, untouchable CEO." Edward's lips pressed together. "It was easier that way." Maya leaned in. "Was it?" Edward's fingers tightened around his glass. Then, slowly, his gaze met hers, and she saw the truth in his eyes. "No, it wasn't easier. It was lonely." Maya reached across the table, resting her hand on his, not as a fiancée, not as part of their arrangement, but as Maya. Edward sucked in a breath, staring at her touch like it was the most foreign thing in the world. Then, slowly, he turned his palm over, his fingers closing around hers. And for the first time, Maya saw it, the man behind the empire. And that was the moment she knew. She was in too deep, and there was no going back. The beginning of the end. The night at the jazz bar changed everything. Edward stopped avoiding her. He started staying home more often, lingering in the kitchen as she made coffee, sitting beside her on the couch, watching as she worked on her art. And he smiled more. Not the sharp, calculated smiles he used for business. Real ones. Maya told herself not to get used to it. But it was already too late. Because for the first time since their arrangement began, Maya let herself believe in the impossible. That maybe, just maybe, Edward Sterling could be hers. But fate had other plans. Because just as she was starting to fall, everything came crashing down. The beginning of the end. A dangerous softening. The tension between Maya and Edward had changed. It was no longer sharp edges in business transactions, no longer calculated glances and empty gestures. Something was growing between them. Something real. Maya noticed it in the way Edward's hand would hover at the small of her back a second longer than necessary. She felt it when his usually cold voice softened just slightly when he said her name. She saw it in the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. Like he was fighting something. Something he wasn't ready to name. And she knew she was in trouble. Because she was fighting it too. And she was losing. The unspoken confession. One evening, after a charity event, Maya found herself standing beside Edward on the penthouse balcony, staring out at the city lights. The air was crisp, the wind brushing against her skin as she wrapped her arms around herself. Edward appeared beside her, silent. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, out of nowhere, he said, "You look different when you're not pretending." Maya blinked, startled by the statement. "What do you mean?" Edward turned to her, his gray eyes unreadable. "At these events, you play the part. You smile, you charm, you blend in." He exhaled. "But here, when you're at the art center, when you're painting, that's the real you." Maya's breath hitched. She had never expected him to notice. But he had. And the fact that he had been watching her, truly seeing her, made her heart pound painfully in her chest. She swallowed hard, searching his face. "And what about you?" Edward frowned. "What about me?" Maya turned to fully face him, the city forgotten. Who is the real Edward Sterling? His jaw clenched. He looked away, as if the answer was something he didn't want to admit. "I don't know." The words were barely above a whisper. Maya's chest tightened. Because for the first time, she realized something terrifying. Edward Sterling, the ruthless billionaire, the man who built an empire, the man who never wavered, was lost. And somehow, despite everything, she wanted to be the one to help him find his way. A night that shouldn't have happened. A week later, the inevitable happened. It started with something small. Maya was curled up on the penthouse couch, sketching in her notebook, when Edward sat beside her without a word. It was nothing unusual. They had started spending more time together, comfortable in each other's presence. But tonight was different. Edward was watching her. Not just glancing, watching. And when she met his gaze, she saw everything he wasn't saying. The battle. The hesitation. The want. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She should have looked away. Should have gotten up. Should have reminded herself that this wasn't real. But she didn't. Instead, she stayed frozen as Edward's hand reached out, tracing the back of her fingers with the lightest touch. Maya sucked in a breath. This is a bad idea. A terrible, terrible idea. But then Edward leaned in, his lips just inches from hers, and whispered, "Tell me to stop." Maya's throat went dry. Because she should tell him to stop. She should remind him of the contract, of the deal, of everything at stake. But she didn't. She couldn't. So instead, she whispered back, "I can't." And that was all it took. The moment she said the words, Edward closed the distance. Their lips met, slow and searching at first, then desperate, like they had both been holding back for too long. Like they both knew this was a mistake but couldn't help themselves. Edward's hand slid to her waist, pulling her closer, and Maya melted into him, letting go of every reason why she shouldn't. Letting herself feel. Letting herself want. Letting herself forget. Just for tonight. The morning after, Maya woke up before Edward. She lay there, tangled in sheets that smelled like him, his arm draped lazily over her waist. And for one blissful moment, she forgot everything. Forgot that they weren't real. Forgot that this wasn't forever. Forgot that the moment he woke up, everything would go back to the way it was. Her chest tightened painfully. She turned slowly, looking at him. Edward Sterling, the untouchable, ruthless billionaire, looked at peace, vulnerable, like a man who had spent his whole life running and for once had finally stopped. Maya swallowed hard, because she knew the truth. They were on borrowed time. And when it ran out, this would break her. With trembling hands, she carefully slid out of bed. She needed to leave. She needed distance before she did something reckless, like fall in love with him completely. But just as she reached the door, his voice stopped her. "Don't go." Maya froze. Her heart pounded. Slowly, she turned around. Edward was awake now, propped up on one elbow, his hair tousled, his gaze heavy with something unreadable. Something real. Maya's breath caught. Because for the first time since this started, he wasn't letting her run. The lies catch up, but they should have known better. Because nothing this perfect ever lasts. 2 nights later, Maya's world came crashing down. She had just finished an art class at the community center when she stepped outside, pulling out her phone to text Edward. Then suddenly, "Miss Brooks." She turned, only to be blinded by flashing lights. A swarm of reporters rushed toward her, shouting, shoving microphones in her face. "Is it true you were hired to be Edward Sterling's fiancée? Did he pay you to pretend to love him?" Maya's stomach dropped. Her entire body went numb. No, 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 no. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not when. Not when she had just let herself believe in this. Not when she had just let herself believe in him. And then, just when she thought it couldn't get worse, a sleek black car pulled up, and Edward stepped out. His eyes locked onto hers immediately, and in that moment, she saw panic. Not the controlled, calculated businessman. Just Edward. And that's when she knew. The truth was out, and it was only a matter of time before everything fell apart. When everything falls apart. A truth that cannot be buried. Maya's world had just exploded. The flashing lights, the swarm of reporters, the shouted questions. It all felt like a nightmare. She could barely hear them over the ringing in her ears. "Is it true you were paid to be Edward Sterling's fake fiancé? Did he buy your love? How long have you been lying to the public?" Maya's legs felt like lead. She couldn't breathe. This wasn't just about her. The art center, the kids, everything she had worked for. It would all be ruined. Then, before she could process anything, a strong hand grabbed her wrist. Edward. His grip was firm, his face stone cold as he pulled her through the mob. "Move." His voice was low, dangerous. The crowd parted just enough for them to reach the car. The door slammed shut behind them, sealing them inside. The noise was gone. But Maya was still shaking. Edward's chest rose and fell with controlled breaths. "Are you okay?" She turned to him, eyes wide. "Do I look okay?" Edward's jaw clenched, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. For the first time since this started, he looked rattled. Edward Sterling never looked rattled. But tonight, they had lost control. And Edward Sterling did not lose control. Maya's breath hitched. "Who leaked it?" Edward exhaled sharply. "I don't know." Maya scoffed. "You don't know? You're Edward Sterling. You control everything. How could you not know?" He didn't respond right away. Then, slowly, he turned to her. And that's when she saw it. The thing she had been too blind to see. He knew. He knew exactly who had done it. Maya's stomach twisted. Claire. Edward's silence was her answer. She laughed bitterly. Of course it was Claire. Edward's fingers flexed against the steering wheel. "I'll handle it." Maya scoffed. "Oh, and how do you plan on handling this, Edward? Pay off the press? Control the media?" She shook her head. This isn't just business. This is my life. Edward's eyes darkened. You think I don't know that? Maya clenched her fists. Do you? Silence. She exhaled shakily, her heart breaking in real time. She had known from the beginning that this was a game, but she had let herself forget. And now she was the one losing. The fallout. The next morning, the headlines were brutal. Billionaire Edward Sterling caught in engagement scandal. Fake fiancée exposed. Maya Brooks, gold digger or just another pawn in Sterling's game. Public outrage as Sterling Enterprises faces fraud allegations. Maya's face was everywhere. Every news station, every website. Her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Calls, texts, people demanding answers. Even the Art Center was being dragged into the mess. How can we trust someone who lied to the whole country? One angry parent had said. And that hurt more than anything else. She had fought so hard for that place. For the kids. And now it was being ripped apart because of a deal she never should have made. Because of him. The breaking point. Edward found her later that night at the penthouse, standing by the window, staring at the city. He stepped closer. Maya. She didn't turn. I fixed it, he said. The company's PR team is working overtime to control the damage. The news cycle will move on in a few days. Maya laughed bitterly. Oh, will they? Will they move on from calling me a fraud? From dragging the one thing I actually care about through the mud? Edward's jaw tightened. I'm handling it. Maya spun around, eyes blazing. You don't get it, do you? Edward's gaze darkened. Then tell me. Maya took a shaky breath, then whispered, This isn't just another business deal, Edward. This is my life. Edward's lips parted slightly. For the first time, he looked lost, like he didn't know how to fix this. Like he was realizing that not everything could be bought, bargained, or controlled. Maya swallowed hard, her throat thick. I shouldn't have said yes to this. I should have walked away. Edward took a step closer. Maya. She shook her head. No, don't. Don't try to fix this with money or power or another one of your deals. This isn't something you can just handle. Edward looked like he wanted to argue. Like he wanted to promise her that he could make it all go away. But he didn't. Because for once, he knew she was right. Maya exhaled shakily. This is over, Edward. The words felt like glass in her throat. Edward stilled. His hands curled into fists at his sides. You don't mean that. Maya forced herself to nod. Yes, I do. Edward's face was unreadable. So that's it. You just walk away? Her heart was breaking. But she forced herself to say it anyway. Yes. Edward inhaled sharply, his Adam's apple bobbing as he clenched his jaw. Fine. His voice was tight. If that's what you want. Maya swallowed the lump in her throat. It's what I need. Edward held her gaze for a long moment. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the room. Maya let out a shaky breath, and when she was finally alone, she let the tears fall. A love that shouldn't have happened. For weeks, Maya tried to forget him. She threw herself into her art, into the community, into fixing the damage that had been done. But nothing felt the same, because he was everywhere. Every time she turned on the TV, there he was. Every time she stepped outside, the world still whispered about them. And every night, when she was alone in her tiny apartment, staring at the ceiling, she thought of him, of his touch, his voice, his kiss, of the man she never should have fallen for, but had, completely. And she hated herself for it, because Edward Sterling wasn't the kind of man who loved. And even if he had, he was already gone. The unexpected knock. One night, 3 weeks after she walked away, there was a knock at her door. Maya sighed, setting her paintbrush down. Probably another reporter. But when she opened it, her heart stopped. Edward. standing there, looking nothing like the man she remembered. His perfect suit was gone. His eyes, usually sharp and unreadable, were messy, vulnerable, and for the first time since they met, he looked like a man who had nothing left to lose. Maya's breath caught. "Edward." His voice was rough when he finally spoke. "I don't care about the contract. I don't care about the deal. I don't care about any of it." He took a shaky breath. "I just care about you." And just like that, Maya's world stopped. When love becomes the truth. The man at her door. Maya stared at Edward, her heart thundering in her chest. He was the last person she expected to see. Not after everything. Not after she walked away. Not after she spent weeks convincing herself that that they, were never real. And yet, here he was, standing at her door, looking nothing like the powerful, composed billionaire the world worshipped. His tie was gone. His shirt was wrinkled, the top buttons undone like he hadn't cared enough to fix them. His hair was a mess, like he had run his fingers through it too many times. And his eyes held a kind of desperation she had never seen before, a kind of desperation that terrified her, because it meant he was real. It meant that, for the first time since they met, Edward Sterling wasn't pretending. Maya's fingers curled around the edge of the door. She should slam it shut. She should tell him to leave. She should remind him that she wasn't his to chase anymore. But she didn't. Because despite everything, despite all the pain and heartbreak and lies, a part of her still wanted to hear what he had to say. Edward exhaled, his throat bobbing. "Say something." Maya's voice was barely above a whisper. "Why are you here, Edward?" His jaw tightened. "Because I can't stay away." Maya's stomach twisted. "You should." Edward flinched. "I tried." His voice was raw, unfiltered. Not the voice of a businessman trying to close a deal, but of a man trying to hold on to something he never should have let go. Maya clenched her jaw. "This isn't fair." Edward ran a hand over his face. "Nothing about us has ever been fair." Maya shook her head, stepping back. "I can't do this again, Edward. I won't." She reached for the door, but Edward caught it before she could close it. His hand was warm against hers, familiar, dangerous. Maya hated how much she still felt him, how much she still wanted to. Edward's voice dropped, his grip tightening slightly. "I know I hurt you." Maya swallowed. "You did." Edward's expression darkened. "And I hate myself for it." She laughed bitterly. "Oh, so what? You woke up one day and decided you had feelings." Edward's breath hitched. "No." He shook his head, his gray eyes locking onto hers like they could somehow make her believe him. "I had them long before I ever admitted it." Maya's pulse skipped. She hated how much she wanted to believe him. Edward inhaled sharply, his voice lower now. "I spent my whole life building something unbreakable, something untouchable." His jaw clenched. "And then you came along. And suddenly, I didn't want to be untouchable anymore." Maya's throat tightened. No, he didn't get to do this. Not after everything. Not after he broke her. She forced herself to step back. "You don't love me, Edward." Edward's breath caught. Maya exhaled sharply. "You love control." She shook her head, her voice thick. "You love winning. And when I left, you lost." She looked him dead in the eyes. "And you hate losing more than anything." Edward flinched, like she had just stabbed him in the chest. Good. Let him hurt. Let him feel what it was like to break and not be able to fix it with money or power. Edward's throat bobbed. "That's not why I'm here." Maya laughed bitterly. "Then why are you?" Edward exhaled. "Because I don't care about control anymore." Maya stilled. Edward took a slow step forward, lowering his voice. "I don't care about power, or money, or contracts." His hands curled into fists at his sides. "None of it matters. Not if I don't have you. Maya's heart stopped. No, 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 no. He wasn't supposed to say that. He wasn't supposed to mean it. Maya shook her head, stepping back. Edward. Edward grabbed her hand. I love you. The words crashed into her like a storm. Raw. Honest. Undeniable. Maya's breath hitched. Don't say that. Edward's grip tightened. It's the truth. Maya's eyes burned. No, it's not. Edward shook his head, stepping closer. Maya. His voice was low. I love you. Maya squeezed her eyes shut, because if she looked at him, if she saw the truth in his eyes, she would fall apart. She would break, and she wasn't sure if she could put herself back together again. Edward's voice was barely above a whisper now. I love you. Maya swallowed hard. Even if that's true, it doesn't change anything. Edward's throat bobbed. It changes everything. Maya opened her eyes, shaking her head. You think love is enough. You think you can just say those words and fix everything. Her voice cracked. Love doesn't erase what you did. Edward's expression tightened. I know. His voice was heavy with something raw. And I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance. Maya clenched her fists. To do what? Edward exhaled, his eyes never leaving hers. To prove to you that I'm not that man anymore. Silence. Maya's heart was shattering. Because she wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that he had changed. That he could be hers. But could she trust him? Could she trust herself? Maya exhaled shakily. Edward. She wanted to say no. She wanted to walk away. But when she looked at him, truly looked at him, she knew she couldn't. Because despite everything, despite all the lies, the heartbreak, the mistakes, she still loved him too. And that was the scariest truth of all. Maya swallowed hard. One chance. Edward's breath caught. Maya took a shaky breath. Don't waste it. Edward exhaled, his shoulders sagging in relief. Then, without another word, he pulled her into his arms. Maya let herself melt into him. Just this once. Because maybe, just maybe, they could be real after all.